Domestic violence. Even the mention of the words conjures up the larger-than-life image of some battered woman on a highway billboard, a day-glow orange hotline number beneath her bruised profile, and some catchy slogan like "Love shouldn't hurt." And no, I'm not insensitive to battered women. My heart goes out to any real victim. But the day I see images of bruised men on those billboards, I'll be less prone to being offended at seeing the images of beaten women. Too many of them are being propped up like the starving children you see on your TV at 2 in the morning. You know, the ones you can feed, clothe, and send to Harvard for $12 a month. The myth we embrace about all this is simple and designed for the simple-minded. Domestic violence is almost exclusively perpetrated by men against women. Even better, it means brutish thugs pounding the crap out of Mary Poppins for burning the toast. And here and there, that's true. But if you think it defines the problem, or even comes close, you need to take Dr. Phil off your TiVo to-do list and start picking up some real books. This nonsense didn't spring up out of thin air. It was and is the raison d'etre of feminists in their claim of patriarchal domination and how that extended into the home and family. It makes sense, especially if you don't think about it, and of course we didn't, so the idea spread like chlamydia in a cat house. But let's think about it now. You deserve a lot more depth than is offered in a soundbite. I'll start with some research that most would feel was from a reputable source, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. This is the summary of their findings as published in the American Journal of Public Health, May 2007. First, almost 24% of all relationships had some level of violence. Half of those relationships involved just one of the partners being violent, the other half were reciprocally violent. Now, in relationships where violence was perpetrated by just one person, over 70% of that was committed by the woman. Did you get that? In all relationships in that particular study, more than 7 out of 10 batterers were female. Let's look even closer at the data as it relates to relationships where both partners are violent. This half is even more interesting. The study concluded that reciprocally violent relationships were most likely to result in injuries, particularly to women. They were also a solid predictor of future repeated violence for women, but not men. In other words, women who engaged in mutual combat with men were much more likely to have a pattern of instigating repeated assaults. Men's violence was much more likely to be isolated and, contrary to the redundant assertions of feminists, not likely to be repeated. Now let me sum up those conclusions in a clearer form of English. Relationships where both are violent are more likely to result in the woman getting hurt. Those relationships are also marked by women who are much more likely than men to initiate and maintain that violence in the first place. We have a common expression for much of the men's violence in these situations. It's called hitting back. There is no real excuse for violence, ever, some would say. But there is legal and, in the belief of many, moral justification for self-defense. Either way, it is a judgment call made after and only after an attack has been made. I'll leave it to the attacked to make their own call. In fairness now, it has to be pointed out that this one study, for many reasons, including methodology, can't fairly be generalized to the entire population. And one study alone is easy enough to dispute, even from a sound source. So let's look at 100 more. Professor John Archer is a psychologist at the University of Central Lancashire and the esteemed head of the Aggression Research Group at the same university. In his analysis of 100 British and American studies, he concludes that women are more likely than men to initiate violence in their relationships and are more likely to be aggressive more frequently. He also addresses the myth that women are only violent as a matter of self-defense by reporting that 29% of female college students admitted to physically attacking their boyfriends when no threat was perceived. I know feminists won't be convinced by this, nor will they be by several hundred more studies, but let's look at them anyway. Professor Martin S. Fibert of the California State University Psychology Department conducted an analysis of 249 scholarly investigations, 194 empirical studies, and 55 reviews regarding domestic violence. The aggregate sample size in the reviewed studies was over 250,000 people. Fibert's conclusion? Women are as physically aggressive or more physically aggressive in relationships than men. And if you think that the incidence of female-on-male violence is somehow balanced by women suffering more injuries at the hands of men, think again. There are widely conflicting studies on this. Some of them place women at greater risk, but many of them place men. If we examine FIBRT's annotated bibliography, which covers an exhaustive amount of studies, there are many times more studies cited that show women more likely to inflict serious harm, including with the use of weapons, than are men. Are there other studies that contradict this? Absolutely. But there is a significant enough body of evidence to make three things patently clear. One, domestic violence is not a product of gender. Attributing it to one gender over the other is not only misleading, it actually hinders efforts to address the problem. Two, society is wildly misinformed about the nature, origins, and realities of domestic violence. And three, most of our legal and political handling of domestic violence is based on the myths and not the realities, leaving us to put all of our resources into half of the problem. As in so many other ways, we demonstrate a cultural tendency to remake reality, even embrace lies, when the truth about the fairer sex doesn't make them look all that fair. Now, many people of sound mind might well say, fine, let's just focus our attention on dealing with abusers and the abused regardless of sex. But to say things are not that simple is a monumental understatement. Richard Gellis is currently a dean at the University of Pennsylvania and holds the Joanne and Raymond Welch Chair of Child Welfare and Family Violence in the School of Social Policy and Practice. He is an internationally known expert in domestic violence and was influential in the passage of the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997. Gellis wrote, regarding his work with Suzanne Steinmetz and Murray Strauss, quote, "The response to our finding that the rate of female-to-male violence was equal to the rate of male-to-female violence was not only produced heated scholarly criticism, but intense and long-lasting personal attacks. All three of us received death threats. Bomb threats were phoned into conference centers and buildings where we were scheduled to present." Now, is it just me, or is making terroristic threats of bombing and murder a rather strange way to protest being called violent? Returning to the evidence, though, it would be easy to make an argument that domestic violence is more a female than a male problem. There are, after all, numerous studies that support that conclusion. But that would be as pointless as the current paradigm and might result in my car blowing up the next time I start it. So for those of you screaming for me to quit picking on women and take gender out of the equation, that is precisely what I'm doing, and what I'm asking you to do once and for all. If you really believe that all violence is bad and shouldn't be tolerated, then here's what you can do to prove it. Write Vice President Biden and tell him to seek an end to the Violence Against Women Act, the legislation he authored that allocates billions to women victims but leaves men totally out of the picture. Men are, after all, injured by domestic violence too, 835,000 of them per year in America alone. Start holding shelters and social services to account when they have no real programs designed for men. Their failure to do this is institutionalized sexism and needs to go. Confront police and prosecutors for their actions. Men who call police for help when attacked by their partners are more likely than not to be the one arrested regardless of the circumstances. Victims should be helped, not arrested, incarcerated, and stigmatized. Be sure to express your objections to and boycott media outlets and corporations like Pepsi and FedEx that use men getting abused as a sight gag in their advertising. When you see or hear a public service announcement that says something like a woman is abused in her home every 15 seconds, realize that it is actually a public deception, a convoluted half-truth based in blind bigotry and callous indifference to the victimization of men. Those are a few good beginnings, but you can best start by simply and publicly acknowledging what so few seem to know. Domestic violence has nothing to do with what sex you are. It never has. Disinformation is a poor way to address social ills. In fact, it just breeds more of them.